Welcome. I am Pastor Luis Gierbolini.
And I am Pastor Linda McCrae.
And we want to take a few minutes of your time today to kind of talk to you about the journey that we here at Central Christian Church have done to become an anti-racist institution.
First of all, we know that this is an ongoing journey. And so to go over just a little bit of what we have been doing and trying to do and trying to be. Central, of course, has a pretty long history of working on issues of systemic change. So trying to better improve systems that are oppressing people or exploiting people. And so the more recent part of this journey for Central of anti-racism really goes back to about March of 2020. And that was when we had a workshop, an all-day workshop here in our fellowship hall with about 85 adults from this congregation, so a pretty significant number. And that workshop was organized by Crossroads Anti-Racist Organizing and Training. And so in that workshop, we really began to sort of look systemically at racism and how Central either perpetuates racism or interrupts racism. So following that, of course, the pandemic hit, and so that kind of changed how we worked, but we kept going. In June or July of that year, our board voted to undergo this journey, formally as a congregation to become an anti-racist institution. They named an anti-racism transformation team and also allocated some money in the budget to do this work. And then following that, this anti-racism team continued to receive training from Crossroads for about a year or so after that.
Part of our training was finding ways for us to help the congregation and the team understand how systemic racism has been saturated in not only our American identity, but also in our church identity. And so one of the first things that we did together, not only as a team and a group and a church, was to spend several weeks going over the Seeing White podcast. And this was a podcast that was also heard, I believe, on NPR. I think through them, they were the company that put it out. And so with this Seeing White podcast, what it tried to do was show historically how white identity and its value system has been a part of the American ethos, not only in fields of academia, in the court system, and also in the church. And so it was a great way for us to see the journey in which systemic racism has been seated in the fabric of our society. In addition to that, there were several book studies that the church decided to also do as well. And so one of those was The Church Cracked Open by Stephanie Spellers, a United Methodist, I believe, Episcopal priest. One we did called Braiding Sweetgrass. This was through the Native American tradition. We had a good group of members with us during that particular group. The Parable of the Sower, which was done by our student pastor at the time and one of our members, by Octavia Butler. And I believe sometime in 2022, one of our youth, with its leader, we did How to Be an Anti-Racist by Ibram Kendi. And that was a great series to do with our our youth at church. They responded pretty well to that. And just interesting, it was the remix, which is, he wrote that book and then someone came along and took the information and then also put it in a way that would be geared towards youth and helping them understand in their own particular language. And then more recently, our children and youth ministry team has been working with the parents of our church and raising anti-racist children. So we have, since 2020, since the start of that first training, we have been steadily for the last 3 years doing multiple, attacking this, the idea of systemic racism in multiple ways.
Yeah, and one additional way that we have done that is through at least a couple of sermon series. In 2020, we worked with Valerie Kaur's book called See No Stranger, which is really laying out a vision of a community where we learn to live out what she calls revolutionary love. So love for ourselves, love for others, and love for the enemy. And then the other series that came really directly out of our work with Crossroads was one where we looked at values. We looked at sort of the values of white institutions and kind of juxtaposed those with what we call transforming values. And again, looking at how those play out in our life together and even in our worship. So also over these last few years, there are a few actually, sort of concrete actions that we've taken that have been part of this shift toward an anti-racist identity. One came early in the pandemic. So we, like many churches, were able to apply for and receive the PPP loan, which eventually became a grant because businesses were not required to pay it back, but it was offered to businesses, right, to help out through the pandemic. And so we did that, which was very welcome, but we also in the process realized that one of the reasons we could do that is because we are a white institution that is well connected. And so we know bankers and we know how things work. And the realization that lots of other businesses, especially businesses owned by people of color, might not have those opportunities and connections. So sometime during the following year, we made a decision, our board made a decision to make a grant, to give a grant, pretty sizable for us, to the Urban League, the Indianapolis Urban League, to support their efforts with Black and minority-owned businesses.
During the summer of 2020, this is during the time directly connected to the death of George Floyd, when we saw a rising of protests against police brutality and how Black bodies are treated by society. And so we were approached by Black Lives Matter and another group of clergy who had been providing sanctuary for those groups during protest. One of the locations in which they were using down near the circle was no longer a suitable place, and so we were approached by them. And so with consideration and knowing the groups themselves, we decided that Central was going to be a place where we can provide sanctuary to those protesting against the injustices.
In 2021, we started conversations with Congolese Christian Church, which is a disciples congregation that has been here in Indianapolis for a few years, but that had lost its home. It was nesting in another church, and that they needed to leave there. And so we started in August of 2021, opening space for Congolese Christian Church to meet each Sunday. That congregation is made up of largely of immigrants from the Democratic Republic of Congo.
This past summer, we had, during Linda's sabbatical, we had the opportunity to dive deeper into what it means to be an anti-race institution in several different ways. One, our whole series throughout the summer was able to bring in different voices at the pulpit, and also with worship. And our thought was to continue to expose our congregation to the plethora of voices and ideas that can provide different atmosphere in our worship setting. During that time, we had a group of Central members who were able to do a civil rights tour in Alabama. They journeyed down there and visited several of the museums, walked over I always get the name wrong, Pettus Bridge. And so that was an experience that the members of our congregation got to share with one another. And also during this past summer, we spent the opportunity to have what's called a conversation that matters about our worship as a whole. And so we held several opportunities for members of the church to connect with the anti-racism team as it began trying to to develop shared language and talking about how systemic racism affects worship here at Central Christian Church.